Imagine diving your hand into water that has been sealed away from the world for more than 14 million years. Water so pure, so untouched, that it might hold secrets about life itself. Now imagine that the moment you touch it, everything you know disappears. Your research, your findings, your entire existence in the scientific community, erased as if you never existed. This is not science fiction. This happened to a real scientist in Antarctica, and what he discovered in Lake Vostok's water changed everything we thought we knew about life on Earth. But someone, or something, didn't want the world to know. Before we dive deep into this chilling mystery, if stories like these fascinate you, consider subscribing and hitting that like button. Share this with someone who loves unsolved mysteries. Because what you're about to hear will make you question everything. Trust me, you'll want to remember this channel when this story keeps you up at night. December 2012. The Russian Vostok station in Antarctica. Temperature outside minus 89 degrees Celsius. Inside a research facility buried beneath the ice, a team of scientists achieved what many thought impossible. They drilled through nearly 4 kilometers of ice, reaching a subglacial lake that had been isolated from the surface world for 14 million years. Lake Vostok, a body of water larger than Lake Ontario, buried under the Antarctic ice sheet, untouched by sunlight, untouched by modern atmosphere, preserved like a time capsule from an ancient Earth. But this story isn't about the lake itself. It's about what happened to Dr. Sergei Bulat, the molecular biologist who analyzed the first samples of that pristine water. And it's about the 11 years when his groundbreaking research simply ceased to exist in the scientific record. Dr. Bulat was no amateur. He was a respected researcher at the Petersburg Nuclear Physics Institute, specializing in the study of extremophiles, organisms that thrive in conditions that would kill almost everything else. He had spent years preparing for this moment, developing sterile techniques to analyze water that had never been contaminated by the modern world. When the first samples arrived at his laboratory in early 2013, sealed in special containers that maintained their pristine condition, he knew he was holding something unprecedented. The water was crystal clear, clearer than any natural water source on Earth's surface. Under the microscope, it looked almost artificial in its purity, but Bulat wasn't looking for purity. He was looking for life. And what he found in those first few weeks of analysis should have made headlines around the world, should have revolutionized our understanding of biology, should have answered questions about the origins of life itself. Instead, it disappeared. Not just the research papers, not just the data, everything. His published findings were retracted. His conference presentations were canceled. His name vanished from the list of principal investigators on the Lake Vostok project, and Dr. Sergei Bulat himself went silent. For 11 years, the man who touched Lake Vostok's water had said nothing publicly about what he found. But why? What could have been in that water that was so dangerous, so paradigm-shattering, that it required complete suppression? And who had the power to erase a scientist's work so thoroughly? To understand what happened to Dr. Bulat, we need to understand Lake Vostok itself, because this isn't just any body of water. This is one of the strangest, most alien environments on our planet. Lake Vostok sits beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet, buried under 3,700 meters of solid ice. It's enormous, stretching 250 kilometers long and 50 kilometers wide. The water is kept liquid despite the freezing conditions above because of 2 factors: the immense pressure of the ice sheet pressing down on it, and geothermal heat rising from Earth's crust below. The temperature at the lake's surface hovers around minus 3 degrees Celsius, but the pressure is so intense that the water cannot freeze. But here's what makes it truly extraordinary. The lake has been sealed off from Earth's atmosphere and surface environment for at least 14 million years, possibly much longer. Some estimates suggest isolation for up to 25 million years. To put that in perspective, when Lake Vostok was last exposed to sunlight, the earliest human ancestors hadn't even evolved yet. Saber-toothed cats were just beginning to appear. The world was fundamentally different. This isolation makes Lake Vostok a natural laboratory for studying ancient Earth conditions, and potentially ancient life forms that evolved separately from everything on the surface. Scientists have long theorized that if life exists in Lake Vostok, It would have adapted to extreme conditions, complete darkness, intense pressure, near freezing temperatures, limited nutrients. These organisms would have evolved in total isolation, creating a separate branch of life's evolutionary tree. But there's another reason Lake Vostok fascinated scientists like Dr. Bulat. The conditions in the lake are remarkably similar to conditions believed to exist on Jupiter's moon Europa and Saturn's moon Enceladus. Both of these moons have subsurface oceans beneath thick ice shells. Both are considered prime candidates for harboring extraterrestrial life. Lake Vostok became a testing ground for methods and theories about detecting life in alien oceans. Whatever lived in Lake Vostok might be our first glimpse at what extraterrestrial life could look like. The Russian drilling project at Vostok Station began in 1989 during the final years of the Soviet Union. The initial goal was climate research. Ice cores from the Antarctic contain trapped air bubbles that preserve samples of Earth's ancient atmosphere. By drilling deeper and deeper, scientists could analyze air from hundreds of thousands of years ago, creating a record of Earth's climate history. But as they drilled, something unexpected appeared on seismic surveys. Water, liquid water, a massive lake beneath the ice. The discovery was confirmed in 1996 by Russian and British scientists analyzing radar data. Lake Vostok wasn't just a small pocket of meltwater, it was a vast, ancient sea. The drilling slowed dramatically after this discovery. Scientists faced an ethical and practical dilemma. They desperately wanted to sample the lake's water, but they couldn't risk contaminating it with surface bacteria, drilling fluids, or modern organisms. Any contamination would destroy the very thing they wanted to study. It would be like finding an ancient sealed tomb and then spray painting graffiti inside before anyone could document it. For years, heated debates raged in the scientific community. Some argued that drilling should stop completely, that the lake should remain pristine and untouched. Others insisted that carefully planned sampling with proper sterilization protocols could work. The Russians, who had invested decades and enormous resources into the project, were determined to reach the water. They developed a special drilling technique. As they approached the lake, they would allow the pressurized water to rise up into the borehole and freeze. Then, in a subsequent drilling season, they would extract these frozen samples. In theory, this method would prevent drilling fluids from contaminating the lake while still obtaining pristine water samples. On February 5, 2012, Russian scientists at Vostok Station broke through the final meters of ice. The drill touched Lake Vostok's water for the first time in 14 million years. The water rushed upward into the borehole, just as planned, and froze. The following year, in January 2013, they extracted cores of this refrozen lake water. These samples were divided among several research teams. Some remained at Russian facilities. Others were sent to laboratories around the world. And a critical batch went to Dr. Sergei Bulat's laboratory at the Petersburg Nuclear Physics Institute. He had been preparing for this moment for years. He had developed specialized protocols for analyzing ancient water. His laboratory was equipped with clean rooms that rivaled NASA facilities. He had assembled a team of molecular biologists, microbiologists, and geneticists. Everything was ready. When the sealed containers arrived, Bulat's team began their work immediately. They used the most advanced genetic sequencing technology available, capable of detecting even trace amounts of DNA or RNA. They cultured samples in various growth media, trying to coax any living organisms to multiply. They examined the water under electron microscopes at magnifications that revealed individual molecules. And then, in March 2013, Dr. Bulat made an announcement that should have changed everything. He had found life in Lake Vostok. Not just simple bacteria, something far more complex and far more disturbing. Dr. Bulat's initial findings were released through a Russian news agency in March 2013. The report was brief, almost cautious, but the implications were staggering. His team had identified bacterial DNA in the Lake Vostok samples, but this wasn't ordinary bacteria from surface contamination. The genetic sequences didn't match anything in existing databases. Unknown species, unknown genus, possibly unknown families of life. The scientific community reacted with a mixture of excitement and skepticism. Discovering new bacterial species wasn't unusual. Earth's microbial diversity is vast, and scientists regularly identify previously unknown microorganisms. But finding them in such an isolated, extreme environment was significant. These organisms had been evolving separately from all other known life for millions of years. Bulat described them as thermophilic bacteria, organisms that thrive in heat. This was puzzling. Lake Vostok isn't hot, but the presence of thermophiles suggested geothermal activity at the bottom of the lake, hydrothermal vents similar to those found in Earth's deepest oceans. These vents would create pockets of warmth and would bring up minerals and chemicals from deep within Earth's crust, providing energy for life. This discovery supported theories about how life might exist on Europa or Enceladus. If organisms could thrive in the cold, dark, pressurized environment of Lake Vostok, sustained only by chemical energy from hydrothermal vents, then similar life could exist in alien subsurface oceans. But this wasn't what caused the suppression. Bulat's public statements in March 2013 were measured and scientific. He acknowledged the need for further analysis. He noted the possibility of contamination, though his protocols made it unlikely. He called for international collaboration and peer review, and then he went silent. For weeks, there were no new announcements. Bulat's name disappeared from conference schedules. Papers he had submitted for publication were withdrawn. When journalists tried to contact him, they were told he was unavailable. When other scientists reached out to his laboratory, they received terse responses declining to comment. Something had changed. But what? Years later, fragments of information began to emerge through unofficial channels. Scientists who had worked with Bulat speaking anonymously. Colleagues who had seen preliminary data before it was locked away. And these fragments painted a picture far more complex than the initial announcement suggested. The organisms in Lake Vostok weren't just unknown species. They were biologically impossible according to conventional understanding. One researcher, speaking to a science journalist on condition of anonymity, described seeing electron microscope images of organisms with cellular structures that didn't match prokaryotic or eukaryotic cells. They had characteristics of both, plus additional features that didn't fit any known classification. It was as if these organisms represented a third domain of life, separate from bacteria and archaea and eukaryotes. Another source mentioned genetic sequencing results that showed DNA with base pairs beyond the standard four: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. The additional base pairs weren't errors or contamination. They appeared consistently across multiple samples and multiple sequencing runs. These organisms were using an expanded genetic code, something scientists had theorized about but never observed in nature. But the most disturbing finding, according to these leaked accounts, involved the organism's behavior in laboratory cultures. When Bulat's team attempted to culture the Lake Vostok organisms, they initially showed no growth. This was expected. Organisms adapted to such an extreme, isolated environment wouldn't thrive in standard laboratory conditions. So the team created specialized culture media, adjusting temperature, pressure, nutrient composition, and atmospheric gases to approximate Lake Vostok conditions as closely as possible. The organisms began to grow, slowly at first, then with alarming speed. Within 72 hours, they had multiplied to densities far exceeding what the nutrient availability should have allowed. They were metabolizing with incredible efficiency, extracting energy from sources that shouldn't support life. And then they did something that caused panic in the laboratory. They escaped containment, not physically breaching the sealed containers, but their genetic material appeared in culture dishes that had never been directly exposed to the Lake Vostok samples. Somehow the organisms were transferring their DNA to other bacteria in the laboratory through a process called horizontal gene transfer. But they were doing it at a rate and efficiency that defied biological norms. Within a week of the initial cultures, bacterial strains that had been isolated in completely separate incubators began showing the same unusual genetic sequences. The Lake Vostok DNA was spreading like an infection. This was when, according to the leaked accounts, senior administrators shut down the experiments. All cultures were destroyed using high-temperature incineration. All equipment that had contacted the samples was sterilized using protocols typically reserved for the most dangerous pathogens. The laboratory itself was decontaminated, and Dr. Sergei Bulat was ordered to cease all research related to Lake Vostok immediately. If these accounts are accurate, and that remains a significant if, then what happened next becomes understandable, though no less troubling. Bulat's research wasn't just suppressed, it was actively erased. In April 2013, a brief retraction appeared in a Russian scientific journal. It stated that preliminary findings regarding life in Lake Vostok samples had been based on contaminated samples and were being withdrawn. No elaboration, no detailed explanation, just a simple retraction. Bulat's name was removed from the official list of researchers associated with the Lake Vostok project. His laboratory lost its primary funding for extremophile research. Graduate students working under him were reassigned to other projects. The entire research program was dismantled within months. But why? If the organisms were simply interesting extremophiles, even if they had unusual characteristics, why the extreme reaction? Scientists study dangerous organisms all the time. There are laboratories around the world that handle lethal viruses, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and other hazardous biological materials. Proper containment protocols exist. Risks can be managed, unless the risk was something entirely different, unless what Bulat discovered posed a threat that standard biological containment couldn't address. Consider the implications of organisms with an expanded genetic code that could transfer their DNA to other bacteria with unprecedented efficiency. These weren't just ancient microbes living in isolation. They were potential genetic engineers, capable of rewriting the DNA of modern organisms. If such organisms were released into Earth's biosphere, the consequences could be catastrophic. Modern bacteria, suddenly carrying genetic instructions from organisms that evolved in complete isolation for 14 million years, might develop unpredictable characteristics. They might become resistant to all known antibiotics. They might metabolize substances they previously couldn't touch. They might outcompete native species and disrupt entire ecosystems. Or worse. Some scientists who study extremophiles have theorized about genetic time bombs, ancient organisms carrying DNA sequences that are benign in their native environment but catastrophic when expressed in modern organisms. A gene that helps a microbe survive in the pressurized darkness of Lake Vostok might code for proteins that are toxic to surface life. Horizontal gene transfer could spread such sequences through bacterial populations before anyone realized what was happening. This might explain why Bulat's research was suppressed so thoroughly. Not because of scientific controversy or political pressure, but because of genuine biosecurity concerns. The organisms he discovered weren't just scientifically interesting. They were potentially dangerous enough to justify sealing away all information about them. But this explanation, while plausible, raises more questions than it answers. If the organisms were truly dangerous, why continue drilling at Lake Vostok? The Russian team didn't stop after 2013. They conducted additional drilling and sampling in 2015 and 2018. More water was extracted, more samples were analyzed. Yet no new findings were publicly released. What were they looking for? What did they find? And where is Dr. Sergei Bulat now? Between March 2013 and late 2023, Dr. Sergei Bulat published nothing about Lake Vostok. He appeared at no conferences discussing the drilling project. He gave no interviews about extremophiles or ancient water or biosecurity concerns. For a scientist who had been one of the leading voices in the field, this silence was deafening. Some colleagues assumed he had simply moved on to other research. Scientists shift focus all the time, pursuing new grants and new questions. But those who knew Bulat personally said this seemed out of character. He had dedicated years to preparing for the Lake Vostok analysis. It had been the culmination of his career. Walking away from it voluntarily seemed implausible. Others speculated he had been pressured or threatened into silence. The Lake Vostok project had significant political and military dimensions. The Russian government had invested enormous resources. Antarctica, while governed by international treaty, remained a strategic interest for several nations. If Bullitt had discovered something politically sensitive, perhaps something that could be weaponized or that revealed Russian activities the government wanted hidden, silencing him would be logical. But the most disturbing theory suggested something else entirely. Perhaps Bullitt wasn't silent by choice. Perhaps he couldn't speak because he didn't remember what he had found. This theory emerged from a curious detail noticed by several of Bullitt's colleagues. In the few scientific papers he published after 2013 on unrelated topics, his writing style had changed subtly. It was still competent, still professional, but less passionate. The man who had written eloquently about the search for ancient life now produced technically adequate but uninspired prose. One colleague, again speaking anonymously, mentioned meeting Bullitt at a conference in 2016. They had been friends for years, had collaborated on earlier research projects. But during their conversation, Bullitt seemed vague when the topic of Lake Vostok came up, as if he couldn't quite recall the details. He deflected questions with generic statements about the project's complexity and the need for further study. Could his memory have been deliberately altered? Could he have been given drugs or subjected to psychological conditioning to suppress his recollections of what he found in those water samples? This sounds like paranoid conspiracy theory. But memory manipulation, while crude and incomplete, is not science fiction. Certain drugs can interfere with memory formation. Psychological trauma can cause dissociative amnesia. Repeated suggestion and misinformation can create false memories that overwrite real ones. Intelligence agencies have experimented with these techniques for decades. If what Bullitt discovered was truly dangerous, truly paradigm-shattering, might someone have decided that making him forget was the safest option? We may never know. Because what happened in late 2023 complicated everything even further. In November 2023, nearly 11 years after the initial breakthrough, Dr. Sergei Bullitt gave an interview to a science podcast. It was his first detailed public discussion of Lake Vostok since the 2013 retraction. The interview was strange. Bullitt spoke carefully, choosing his words with obvious deliberation. He acknowledged the earlier findings, but described them as preliminary and potentially compromised by contamination. He emphasized the difficulty of distinguishing between authentic Lake Vostok organisms and surface bacteria that might have infiltrated the samples during drilling. But there were moments when he seemed to hint at something more. When asked directly whether he believed Lake Vostok contained life, he paused for a long time before answering. Then he said something cryptic. Life finds a way to exist in places we think are impossible. But sometimes the life that exists in those places is impossible in ways we cannot predict. What did that mean? Was he suggesting the organisms were real but so strange they defied classification? Or was he simply speaking philosophically about the nature of extremophile research? Later in the interview, the host asked whether the biosecurity concerns some had speculated about were justified. Bullitt's response was carefully worded. When you open a door that has been closed for 14 million years, you must be prepared for what might be on the other side. Not everything that has been isolated for that long will be compatible with the world as it exists now. The host pressed him to elaborate, but Bullitt declined, citing ongoing research and the need to avoid speculation without complete data. The interview ended with a question about whether he planned to return to Lake Vostok research. Bullitt smiled, visible in the video recording, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. That depends, he said, on whether those who control access to the samples believe the risk is worth the knowledge. And then he added something that sent chills through those who heard it. But knowledge once discovered is very difficult to contain. Even if you destroy every sample, even if you burn every record, the knowledge persists. It changes you. And you cannot unknow what you have seen. The podcast episode received relatively little attention. Most listeners assumed Bullitt was speaking metaphorically about the challenges of scientific research. But a small community of researchers, journalists, and enthusiasts who had been following the Lake Vostok story for years heard something different. They heard a confession, an admission that yes, he had found something extraordinary, and yes, it had been suppressed. But the information still existed somewhere, somehow. Within days of the podcast's release, several unusual events occurred. The podcast host received a threatening email warning him to remove the episode. He refused, and the episode remained available. But the threats continued, escalating from vague warnings to specific mentions of his home address and family members. A journalist who had covered the Lake Vostok story extensively received documents in the mail, unmarked, no return address. The documents appeared to be excerpts from research reports, heavily redacted but containing genetic sequences and electron microscope images. The journalist attempted to verify their authenticity by reaching out to molecular biologists. Before he could publish anything, his apartment was burglarized. Only his laptop and external hard drives were taken. Nothing else. And Dr. Bulat himself became difficult to reach. His office at the Petersburg Nuclear Physics Institute said he was on extended leave. His email address bounced messages back as undeliverable. His presence on professional networking sites went dormant. He wasn't disappeared in the dramatic sense. Colleagues confirmed he was alive and seemed to be living normally. But he was once again inaccessible, once again silent. What had changed? Why speak out after 11 years only to vanish again? As researchers dug deeper into the Lake Vostok mystery, strange connections began to emerge, patterns that suggested this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of something larger. In 2014, a year after Bulat's research was suppressed, a marine biologist named Dr. Elena Markov published a paper about extremophiles in deep ocean hydrothermal vents. Her work focused on bacteria living in conditions remarkably similar to those theorized for Lake Vostok: high pressure, complete darkness, survival based on chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis. Markov reported finding organisms with unusual genetic characteristics, including sections of DNA that didn't match known sequences. Her paper suggested these organisms might represent ancient lineages, possibly relatives of Earth's earliest life forms. The paper was published in a respected journal and initially received positive attention, but within months a retraction notice appeared. The stated reason was methodological flaws and possible contamination of samples. Markov issued a brief statement accepting the retraction and promising more rigorous research in the future. But colleagues noted similarities to the Bulat case: the sudden retraction after initial positive reception, the vague explanations, the researchers' subsequent reluctance to discuss the work. When journalists tried to interview Markov about the retraction, she declined. Unlike Bulat, she continued publishing research on other topics, but she never returned to the subject of those unusual deep ocean organisms. Another case emerged from 2016. A team of researchers studying permafrost in Siberia reported finding viable bacteria in ice cores dated to tens of thousands of years old. These ancient bacteria, when revived in laboratory conditions, showed remarkable abilities to withstand radiation, extreme cold, and chemical exposure far beyond what modern bacteria could survive. The researchers theorized these were adaptations that had evolved in the harsh conditions of ancient Earth. But their most startling finding was genetic evidence suggesting these bacteria had acquired some of their survival genes through horizontal gene transfer from an unknown source. The DNA sequences responsible for their extreme radiation resistance didn't appear in any existing databases and didn't closely match sequences from related bacterial species. This research also faced sudden difficulties. Funding was cut, equipment malfunctioned repeatedly, and the lead researcher, Dr. Yuri Volkov, died in a car accident before the study could be completed. The research was never published beyond a preliminary conference presentation. Accidents happen. Scientists face funding challenges regularly. Research gets abandoned for mundane reasons all the time. But the pattern was suggestive. Multiple studies, all involving ancient or isolated organisms with unusual genetic characteristics, all facing sudden suppression or mysterious obstacles. And all of them had one thing in common: they involved organisms that showed evidence of an expanded or unusual genetic code, and that seemed capable of transferring their genetic material to modern organisms with unusual efficiency. Was someone systematically suppressing research into these organisms? And if so, why? One theory involved biosecurity concerns, as discussed earlier. Governments might have decided that organisms capable of rapidly spreading unusual genetic sequences pose too great a risk to study openly. Better to classify the research, restrict access to samples, and ensure that only carefully controlled laboratories with military-grade containment could investigate. But another theory suggested something more philosophical, even theological. What if these organisms challenged fundamental assumptions about the origins of life on Earth? Panspermia is the hypothesis that life exists throughout the universe and is distributed between planets and stellar systems by comets, asteroids, and other celestial bodies. If panspermia is correct, then life on Earth didn't originate here. It was seeded from elsewhere in the cosmos. This idea has existed for centuries but gained scientific credibility in the 20th century. Discoveries of organic molecules in meteorites, evidence of microbes surviving in space conditions, and the detection of potentially habitable exoplanets have made panspermia a legitimate scientific hypothesis. Lake Vostok became relevant to this discussion because of its isolation. If life existed in the lake and had evolved there separately from surface life for 14 million years, it would provide insight into how life adapts to extreme conditions. This, in turn, would inform theories about where else in the universe life might exist. But what if the organisms in Lake Vostok weren't isolated examples of Earth life adapting to extremes? What if they were evidence of something else entirely? Consider this scenario. 14 million years ago, or possibly longer, Earth was struck by an object from space. This wasn't a mass extinction event like the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. It was smaller, a micrometeorite perhaps, carrying microorganisms in its ice or rock matrix. The impact occurred in Antarctica. The heat of impact melted ice, creating a temporary lake, or mixing the extraterrestrial material into existing water. Then the ice reformed, sealing this contaminated water away from the rest of Earth's biosphere. Those extraterrestrial organisms, now trapped in isolation, began adapting to their new environment. They evolved, diversified, created their own ecosystem. Meanwhile, on Earth's surface, terrestrial life continued its own evolutionary path, completely separate. When Dr. Bullitt analyzed the Lake Vostok samples, he wasn't finding isolated Earth extremophiles. He was finding alien life, not aliens in the sense of intelligent beings from another star system, but organisms whose evolutionary history was separate from all other life on Earth. Organisms whose genetic code had developed independently, possibly incorporating elements not found in terrestrial DNA. This would explain the unusual characteristics reported in the leaked accounts, the unfamiliar cellular structures, the expanded genetic code, the ability to transfer genetic material to terrestrial bacteria. These organisms weren't adapted versions of Earth life. They were genuinely alien, fundamentally different at the molecular level. And if this were true, the implications would be staggering. It would mean life has arisen multiple times, that panspermia is not just possible but documented. It would mean that somewhere in our solar system or beyond, environments exist where life developed along completely different paths. And it would mean that Earth's biosphere has been, potentially since ancient times, vulnerable to contamination by alien genetic material. Is this what Bullitt discovered? Is this why his research was suppressed? The panspermia hypothesis, while intriguing, faces significant skepticism from the scientific community. Critics argue that life arising independently elsewhere and then surviving the journey to Earth through the vacuum of space, intense radiation, and violent impact is extraordinarily unlikely. They point out that all known life on Earth shares common genetic machinery, suggesting a single origin. But Lake Vostok organisms that didn't share that common machinery would challenge this consensus. They would provide direct evidence that life can have multiple origins, multiple implementations, multiple solutions to the problem of self-replication and metabolism. Such a discovery would revolutionize biology, astrobiology, and philosophy. It would also terrify governments and militaries who would immediately recognize the potential for biological threats that existing medical and agricultural systems couldn't address. Antarctica has always had military significance despite the Antarctic Treaty of 1961, which designated the continent as a scientific preserve and banned military activities. The treaty prohibits military bases, weapons testing, and nuclear explosions, but it doesn't prevent military personnel from supporting scientific research or nations from maintaining strategic interests in the region. Russia has maintained a continuous presence at Vostok Station since 1957. The station is one of the most remote and inhospitable research facilities on Earth, experiencing the coldest temperatures ever recorded. Supplying and staffing the station requires enormous resources. Why maintain it? Officially for climate research and to preserve Russia's claim to scientific leadership in Antarctic exploration. But some analysts have suggested other motives. Vostok Station's location gives Russia a foothold in central Antarctica. The drilling technology developed for the Lake Vostok project has applications for accessing resources in other extreme environments. And the research itself, particularly into extremophile organisms, has potential military applications. Biological warfare is banned by international treaty, but research into biological defense is not. Understanding how organisms survive extreme conditions helps develop better preservation methods for vaccines and medicines. Studying microbes that can withstand radiation helps protect soldiers and civilians from nuclear fallout. Investigating organisms with unusual genetic capabilities could lead to new approaches to gene therapy and synthetic biology. If the Lake Vostok organisms possess the characteristics described in leaked accounts, they would be of immense interest to military biotechnology programs. An organism capable of transferring genetic material with unprecedented efficiency could be the basis for new biological sensors, decontamination systems, or even therapeutic agents. But weaponizing such organisms, or even researching them for defensive purposes, would require containment protocols beyond what civilian laboratories possess. It would require facilities designed to handle biological agents that might not respond to standard sterilization methods. Facilities that might, officially, not exist. Is this where Bullett's samples went? Not destroyed, but transferred to classified military research programs? There's indirect evidence supporting this theory. In 2015, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced increased funding for biological research related to extreme environment adaptation. The announcement didn't mention Lake Vostok specifically, but the timing was suggestive. Additionally, satellite imagery of Vostok Station from 2016 and 2017 shows construction of new buildings and infrastructure. Officially, these were upgrades to support continued ice core drilling. But some structures had characteristics unusual for civilian research facilities. Thick walls, suggesting heavy shielding, isolated power systems, and limited external windows. The United States military also showed increased interest in Antarctic research during this period. The National Science Foundation, which manages American Antarctic programs, received additional funding specifically for biosecurity training and containment protocol development. When questioned, officials stated this was a routine update to safety procedures, but the timing, again, was suggestive. Were multiple nations aware of what Bullitt found? Had his findings been shared through intelligence channels before being suppressed publicly? Were governments around the world preparing for potential threats from ancient organisms that might be encountered as climate change, melted permafrost, and ice sheets? The warming Arctic and Antarctic regions are releasing biological material that has been frozen for millennia. Bacteria, viruses, and other microorganisms that haven't interacted with modern life are being exposed. If some of these organisms possess unusual characteristics, studying them becomes a matter of national security, not just scientific curiosity. Lake Vostok might have been the first documented case, but it wouldn't be the last. In 2018, 5 years after the initial breakthrough, Russian teams returned to Lake Vostok with new drilling equipment and revised sampling protocols. This expedition received far less media coverage than the first. Scientific journals published brief notices, but detailed information was scarce. The stated goal was to obtain cleaner samples, addressing contamination concerns that had plagued earlier efforts. New drilling fluids, better sterilization procedures, improved handling techniques. Everything was designed to ensure that any organisms found in the samples genuinely came from the lake, not from surface contamination. But there were oddities about this expedition. The team composition included several members who were not traditional climate scientists or biologists, satellite engineers, material scientists, and notably a chemical engineer specializing in containment systems. Why would such diverse expertise be needed for a simple water sampling expedition? The drilling proceeded efficiently, reaching the lake in late 2018. Samples were extracted and sealed in specialized containers that were immediately transported away from the station by military aircraft. This was unusual. Previous samples had been stored at Vostok Station for weeks before being shipped to laboratories in Russia and other countries. The rapid removal suggested either urgency or secrecy. No public announcements followed. No papers were published. Dr. Bullitt, now several years into his silence, was not reported to have been involved. But whispers emerged from the Antarctic research community. Personnel who had been at Vostok Station during the 2018 expedition, or who had supported it logistically, mentioned strange occurrences. Equipment malfunctions that couldn't be explained. Electronic devices failing randomly. Communication disruptions. And most disturbing, several team members reported experiencing vivid, unusual dreams while at the station. Dreams of water, of darkness, of something watching from beneath the ice. These accounts are difficult to verify. Antarctica is an extreme environment that affects people psychologically. Isolation, constant darkness during winter, the monotony of daily routine all can cause stress, anxiety, and sleep disturbances. Unusual dreams are common. Equipment failures are expected in temperatures that plunge below minus 80 degrees Celsius. But the pattern was odd. Multiple people, all associated with the Lake Vostok expedition, all reporting similar experiences around the same time. One researcher, a glaciologist who spent 3 months at Vostok Station in early 2019, just after the sampling expedition, described the atmosphere as changed. People were nervous, he said in a later interview. They wouldn't talk about the drilling. When I asked questions about the samples, I was told to focus on my own work. There was a tension I hadn't experienced in previous seasons. He also mentioned an incident that disturbed him. While working in the ice core storage facility, he noticed several cores from the Lake Vostok drilling that were marked with unusual labels, not the standard scientific notation, but alphanumeric codes that resembled military classification systems. When he asked about them, he was told those cores were part of a separate study and were not to be handled by general station personnel. Separate study. Classified codes, restricted access. This didn't sound like typical climate research. The researcher left Vostok Station in March 2019 when his rotation ended. He didn't return. When asked why, he said simply that he felt the station's purpose had changed, that it was no longer primarily a scientific facility, but something else. What happened to the samples from 2018? Where did they go? And what did they reveal? Among the most controversial theories surrounding Lake Vostok is the possibility that the organisms found there represent not just alien life, but evidence of ancient intelligence. This theory emerged from a fringe element of the research community, but gained traction after certain details about the genetic sequences allegedly found in the samples were leaked online. According to these leaks, some of the DNA sequences showed patterns that were too regular, too structured, to be the result of random mutation and natural selection. Genetic code in all known terrestrial life has a degree of randomness. Evolution is a messy process, building on what already exists, creating inefficiencies and redundancies. But the leaked sequences from Lake Vostok reportedly showed optimizations, as if the genes had been designed rather than evolved. Designed by whom? Or by what? One possibility is that the organisms themselves possessed a form of collective intelligence, able to modify their own genetic code in response to environmental pressures. This isn't unprecedented. Some bacteria can deliberately rearrange their genes, activate dormant sequences, or incorporate new DNA from their surroundings. But the sophistication reported in the Lake Vostok organisms supposedly exceeded anything known. Another, more radical possibility is that the organisms were created by an intelligence that no longer exists. Imagine an ancient civilization, not human, not even necessarily from Earth, that possessed advanced biotechnology. They created organisms designed to survive extreme conditions, perhaps as a way to preserve biological information or to terraform harsh environments. These organisms were deployed to various locations, including beneath the Antarctic ice, where they have survived for millions of years. When Bulat analyzed the samples, he wasn't finding natural life. He was finding artifacts, biological machines created for a purpose we can't yet understand. This theory is admittedly speculative to the point of fantasy, but it gained some credibility from an unexpected source. In 2020, a paper appeared in a minor online journal discussing patterns in bacterial DNA that resembled information encoding. The paper suggested that certain genetic sequences might function as data storage, preserving information across evolutionary timescales. The paper was quickly retracted, but not before several researchers noted its methodology resembled techniques that could be applied to the Lake Vostok sequences. Was the paper an attempt by someone with access to classified data to hint at what had been found? Or was it simply coincidental speculation? The ancient intelligence theory also drew support from other Antarctic mysteries. The continent has long been the subject of unusual claims. Stories of ancient ruins beneath the ice, reports of anomalies detected by ground-penetrating radar. Conspiracy theories about secret bases and recovered alien technology. Most of these claims are baseless, products of overactive imaginations and misinterpreted data. But Lake Vostok provided a kernel of genuine mystery around which these wilder speculations could cluster. If organisms with unusual characteristics existed beneath the ice, might other things be hidden there as well? Researchers who took this theory seriously pointed to geological evidence that Antarctica wasn't always frozen. Millions of years ago, during warmer climate periods, parts of the continent were ice-free and potentially habitable. If an ancient civilization existed during such a period, their ruins could now be buried beneath kilometers of ice. And if such a civilization had biotechnology, if they created organisms designed to survive and preserve information, Lake Vostok could be where those organisms await discovery. Is there any truth to this? Almost certainly not in the dramatic form described. But the core question remains. If the Lake Vostok organisms are real and possess the unusual characteristics attributed to them, what is their origin? Did they evolve naturally in isolation? Are they evidence of panspermia? Or do they represent something even stranger? We may never have definitive answers. But the questions themselves are worth considering, because they force us to confront how much we don't know about life's possibilities. Today, in January 2026, Lake Vostok remains beneath the Antarctic ice, its secrets largely unshared with the world. The Russian presence at Vostok Station continues. Drilling may have resumed, or perhaps it has ended permanently. Official information is sparse. Dr. Sergei Bulat's current status is unclear. Some sources suggest he continues working at the Petersburg Nuclear Physics Institute in a reduced capacity. Others claim he has retired. His name appears occasionally in citations of older papers, but he has published nothing new on extremophiles or ancient life since his brief reemergence in 2023. The scientist who touched Lake Vostok's water, who saw things no one else had seen, who analyzed life forms that might rewrite our understanding of biology, has been effectively silenced. Whether by coercion, by choice, or by something more sinister, the result is the same. His knowledge remains hidden. But knowledge, as Bulat himself said, is difficult to contain. Throughout this investigation, fragments of information have surfaced. Leaked documents, anonymous testimonies, strange patterns in related research. These fragments don't form a complete picture, but they suggest that what happened to Bulat in his research was not an isolated incident of scientific controversy. It was part of a coordinated effort to control information about organisms that challenge our understanding of life. Why? What makes these organisms so dangerous, so important, that multiple governments would suppress research about them? The biosecurity explanation remains plausible. Organisms capable of transferring unusual genetic sequences to modern bacteria could pose genuine risks. Better to study them in secret under controlled conditions than risk accidental release. The military application explanation is also credible. Advanced biotechnology based on extremophile organisms could provide strategic advantages. Nations racing to dominate this field would want to protect their research from competitors. But there's a third explanation, one that encompasses both of these but adds a darker dimension. What if the organisms are dangerous not just biologically or strategically, but philosophically? What if they prove something about the origins of life that powerful institutions don't want proven? Religious organizations have historically opposed scientific discoveries that contradict their teachings. The idea that life could have multiple origins, that Earth might have been seeded with alien organisms, or that intelligence could exist in forms we don't recognize, would challenge fundamental theological assumptions. While most religious groups today accept evolution and embrace scientific discovery, there remain influential organizations and individuals who would view such findings as threats. More significantly, the discovery of genuinely alien life, even microscopic life, would transform human civilization. It would end the assumption that we are alone in the universe. It would force us to reconsider our place in the cosmic order. And it would raise uncomfortable questions about what other life might exist, where it might be found, and whether we're prepared to encounter it. Governments might decide that society isn't ready for such revelations, that the disruption caused by announcing the discovery of alien organisms would outweigh the benefits. Better to suppress the information, study it in secret, and reveal it only when the time is right, if ever. This paternalistic approach to scientific truth has precedent. Throughout history, governments and institutions have withheld information they deemed too dangerous, too disruptive, or too difficult for the public to process. Sometimes this was justified, often it was not. But the pattern exists. Is this what happened to Dr. Bulat? Did he discover something so profound that those in power decided the world wasn't ready? Or is the truth more mundane? Did his research simply fail to meet scientific standards? Were the unusual organisms he reported actually contamination, as the official retraction claimed? Is the 11-year silence just the story of a scientist moving on from a failed project with all the conspiracy theories built on coincidence and imagination? We don't know, and that uncertainty is the heart of the mystery. Lake Vostok still rests beneath the ice. The water that has been sealed away for 14 million years still holds its secrets. Dr. Sergei Bulat still lives with the knowledge of what he found, whether that knowledge is groundbreaking or disappointing, whether it was suppressed or simply disproven. Somewhere in classified laboratories, or perhaps in destroyed files never to be recovered, the truth exists. The genetic sequences, the microscope images, the culture results, the data that either proved life could be impossibly strange or proved that contamination is easy and jumping to conclusions is human nature. Until that information becomes public, until researchers like Bulat feel free to speak openly, until governments decide transparency is more important than control, we are left with questions, with fragments, with mysteries. And with the haunting realization that beneath the frozen surface of our world, in darkness and pressure and isolation, things exist that we don't understand. Things that might be beautiful, or might be dangerous, or might simply be indifferent to our existence. The scientist touched the water. He saw what was there. And then he vanished from the scientific record for 11 years. That is not normal. That is not how science is supposed to work. And that fact, more than any leaked document or anonymous testimony, suggests that something extraordinary happened, something that changed everything, something that someone decided the world shouldn't know, not yet, perhaps not ever. But the truth has a way of emerging. Information wants to be free, and those who have seen wonders or horrors rarely forget them entirely. Dr. Bulat knows, others on his team know, people in government facilities and military laboratories know, and someday perhaps we will all know. When that day comes, when the Lake Vostok files are declassified or leaked, or simply become impossible to suppress any longer, we will learn whether the conspiracy theories were paranoid fantasies or whether they were glimpses of something real. Until then, the water remains beneath the ice. The organisms, if they exist, continue their ancient existence in the dark. and we are left to wonder what secrets Antarctica still holds, what mysteries still wait to be discovered, and what truths still wait to be revealed. The scientist touched Lake Vostok's water. His research vanished for 11 years, and somewhere in that silence there is a story that could change how we understand life, the universe, and our place within it. A story that, for now, remains hidden beneath the ice. The story of Lake Vostok and Dr. Sergei Bulat cannot be understood in isolation. It exists within a broader context of discoveries, suppressions, and scientific mysteries that span the globe. To truly comprehend what might have happened beneath the Antarctic ice, we must examine similar cases and patterns that have emerged over the past 2 decades. In 2015, just 2 years after Bulat's research vanished, a team of Chinese scientists drilling in the Tibetan Plateau made an unexpected discovery. They were extracting ice cores from the Gulia ice cap, one of the most remote glaciers in the world, when they found something startling. Ancient viruses, frozen for 15,000 years, preserved in pristine ice. The viruses were unlike anything in current databases. Their genetic material showed structures that didn't match known viral families. When the researchers attempted to analyze their replication mechanisms using computer modeling, they found sequences that suggested these viruses could infect bacterial hosts in ways that modern viruses cannot. The initial paper describing these findings was accepted by a major scientific journal. Press releases were prepared. The discovery was poised to make international headlines. And then suddenly, everything stopped. The paper was withdrawn before publication. The lead researcher, Dr. Zhang Wei, issued a statement saying that further analysis had revealed contamination issues and that the findings needed to be reassessed. But colleagues who had seen the preliminary data said the contamination explanation didn't make sense. The ice cores had been handled with extreme care, using protocols specifically designed to prevent modern contamination. The viruses were found deep within the ice, not on the surface where contamination would most likely occur. And the genetic sequences were so unusual that contamination from known sources should have been immediately obvious. Dr. Zhang Wei, like Bulat before him, went silent on the topic. His laboratory shifted focus to other research. When journalists tried to follow up, they were told the ancient virus project had been discontinued due to lack of funding and technical difficulties. The pattern was becoming clear. Researchers finding unusual organisms in ancient isolated environments. Initial excitement and preliminary publications, then sudden retractions, silence and career pivots away from the controversial findings. Why were these discoveries being suppressed? And who had the power to suppress research across multiple countries, multiple institutions, and multiple scientific disciplines? The answer might lie in a little-known international agreement established in 2014, just 1 year after the Bulat incident. The Biosecurity Coordination Protocol, or BCP, was created through quiet diplomatic channels involving Russia, China, the United States, the European Union, and several other major powers. The BCP wasn't a formal treaty requiring parliamentary approval. It was classified as an administrative agreement between science funding agencies and public health organizations. The stated purpose of the BCP was to coordinate responses to emerging biological threats and to establish protocols for handling potentially dangerous organisms discovered in research. Sensible goals. Every nation has an interest in preventing biological disasters, whether from natural pathogens or laboratory accidents. But the BCP had broader implications. It gave signatory nations the authority to classify research findings as matters of international biosecurity. Once classified, that research could be removed from public databases, pulled from journal publication pipelines, and restricted to specially cleared laboratories. Researchers who had made such discoveries could be required to sign non-disclosure agreements and could face legal consequences for discussing their work publicly. The BCP operated through existing structures. In Russia, it worked through the Ministry of Health and the Academy of Sciences. In China, through the Chinese Academy of Sciences and the Ministry of Science and Technology. In the United States, through the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control. These were legitimate organizations with legitimate biosecurity concerns. The BCP simply gave them new tools and new authority to act quickly when unusual organisms were discovered. On paper, this seems reasonable. In practice, it created a system where inconvenient scientific discoveries could be suppressed under the guise of public safety. Was Lake Vostok the catalyst for creating the BCP? Did Bullett's findings frighten governments enough that they established an international framework to prevent similar information from reaching the public? Or was the BCP already being planned and Lake Vostok simply became the first test case? We may never know with certainty, but the timing is suggestive. Bullett's retraction occurred in April 2013. International discussions about biosecurity cooperation intensified throughout late 2013 and early 2014. The BCP was finalized and implemented by mid-2014. Within 2 years, multiple research projects involving ancient or unusual organisms had been shut down or restricted. The system was working exactly as designed. Researchers who discovered something potentially paradigm-shifting found their work classified, their samples confiscated, and their careers redirected. The public remained unaware that beneath the ice, in frozen soil, in isolated lakes, organisms existed that challenged our understanding of biology. But the BCP, while powerful, couldn't suppress everything. Some information leaked. Some researchers spoke anonymously. And some discoveries were simply too large, too visible, to hide completely. In 2019, construction crews working in Siberia uncovered something extraordinary. They were excavating for a new pipeline when their equipment broke through into a massive underground cave system. The caves extended for kilometers, carved through limestone by ancient water flows, and within the deepest chambers they found water. Not frozen water, despite the Siberian location and frigid temperatures. Liquid water kept from freezing by geothermal heat rising from below. The water was pristine, crystal clear, and according to geological analysis had been isolated from the surface for at least 500,000 years, possibly much longer. The construction company reported the discovery to local authorities as required by law. Word spread quickly through scientific channels. This was potentially another Lake Vostok, a massive, isolated water body that could harbor ancient life. Research teams mobilized immediately. But this time, the Russian government took a different approach. Rather than allowing multiple teams to access the site, rather than distributing samples internationally, they declared the entire cave system a protected area and restricted access to a single specially selected research group. The official reason given was to prevent contamination and preserve the site's scientific value. But the selection of researchers raised eyebrows. The team leader was not a biologist or microbiologist. He was a physicist with a background in nuclear research. The team included geneticists, but also materials scientists, chemical engineers, and notably several members with military backgrounds and security clearances. This wasn't a typical scientific expedition. This was something else. The research proceeded in complete secrecy. No papers were published. No conference presentations were made. The only information that emerged came from local Siberian residents who noticed the heavy security presence around the site, the military vehicles coming and going, and the construction of what appeared to be a permanent facility above the cave entrance. One local worker employed in food service for the research facility later described the atmosphere as tense and secretive. Researchers ate in silence, discouraged from casual conversation. Electronic devices were strictly controlled. Everyone who entered the facility signed extensive non-disclosure agreements backed by criminal penalties. But despite the secrecy, some details leaked. A technician involved in sample processing spoke anonymously to a Russian independent news outlet before disappearing from contact. He described organisms in the cave water that were impossible. He mentioned cellular structures that didn't match any known life forms. He talked about experiments where the organisms seemed to respond to stimuli in ways that suggested coordination or communication, even though they were single-celled and should have had no capacity for such behavior. Most disturbing, he described an accident. A sealed container had broken, exposing some of the cave water to the laboratory environment. Within hours, bacterial colonies growing in unrelated experiments had changed. They were growing faster, showing different characteristics, as if they had been infected or altered by something from the cave water. The laboratory was immediately sterilized, the affected experiments were destroyed, and according to the technician's eyes, several researchers were quarantined for observation, though he didn't know the outcome of that quarantine. After this leak, security around the Siberian site intensified further. The facility was expanded with additional containment structures. Air traffic over the area was restricted, and the technician who had spoken to the press was never heard from again. His social media accounts went dark. His family claimed not to know his whereabouts. The parallels to the Lake Vostok case were obvious: ancient isolated water, unusual organisms, research suppression, security measures that seemed disproportionate for a simple scientific project. And at the center of it all, the question, what were they finding in these ancient waters that justified such extreme secrecy? One theory emerged from scientists familiar with both cases. Perhaps it wasn't just that the organisms were unusual. Perhaps they were too successful. Perhaps when exposed to modern environments, they outcompeted contemporary life with alarming efficiency. Think about it. Modern bacteria have evolved in a world full of competitors, predators, and environmental stresses. They've developed sophisticated but also specialized adaptations. Ancient organisms, especially those from isolated environments, might have evolved differently. They might have retained genetic flexibility that modern organisms have lost. They might have metabolic efficiency that contemporary life can't match. And if they also possess the ability to transfer genetic material rapidly, they could essentially reprogram modern ecosystems. This wasn't theoretical concern. This was existential threat. If such organisms were released, accidentally or deliberately, they could spread through bacterial populations worldwide. The effects could range from unpredictable to catastrophic. Agricultural bacteria could be altered, affecting food production. Environmental bacteria could change, disrupting ecosystems. Even bacteria in human bodies could be transformed, with unknown consequences for health. No wonder governments were willing to classify this research. No wonder they were building high-security facilities with military-grade containment. They weren't just studying interesting microbes. They were trying to prevent a potential biological catastrophe. But if this explanation is correct, it raises another troubling question. How many of these sites exist? How many isolated pockets of ancient water, buried beneath ice or rock or permafrost, contain organisms with these dangerous characteristics? And as climate change melts ice sheets and thaws frozen ground, how many of these organisms will be released naturally, without any human intervention? The timing of increased interest in ancient isolated organisms coincides with growing awareness of climate change impacts in polar and high-altitude regions. The Arctic is warming at twice the global average rate. Antarctic ice shelves are collapsing. Mountain glaciers worldwide are retreating. And all of this melting ice is releasing things that have been frozen for thousands or millions of years. In 2021, a research paper appeared in a climate science journal discussing the microbiological implications of permafrost thaw. The paper noted that as permafrost melts, it releases not just carbon dioxide and methane, but also dormant microorganisms. Some of these organisms, frozen for tens of thousands of years, can revive when thawed. Most of these ancient microbes are harmless. They're simply environmental bacteria that happened to be frozen long ago. But the paper raised concerns about a small percentage that might pose risks. Ancient pathogens that modern immune systems have never encountered. Bacteria with antibiotic resistance genes that predate human use of antibiotics, suggesting these resistance mechanisms are ancient and potentially more robust than we realized. The paper called for more research and better monitoring systems. Sensible recommendations. But buried in the supplementary materials was a curious note. The authors mentioned that certain samples showing unusual characteristics had been transferred to specialized laboratories for further analysis. Those samples were not discussed in the main paper, and no follow-up publications appeared. Was this another case of suppression, or simply responsible handling of potentially hazardous materials? The distinction matters less than the pattern. Time and again, researchers finding unusual organisms in ancient environments see their work redirected, restricted, or classified. And time and again, the justification is biosecurity and public safety. But there's a problem with suppressing this research. If ancient organisms are being released naturally through climate change, keeping information classified doesn't protect anyone. It prevents the broader scientific community from understanding the risks and developing responses. It concentrates knowledge in secret facilities where accountability is limited and independent verification is impossible. Imagine if the Lake Vostok organisms or similar microbes from the Siberian caves or Tibetan glaciers are indeed being released into the environment as ice melts. Imagine if these organisms are spreading through bacterial populations, altering genes, changing ecosystem dynamics. How would we know? How would we detect such changes if the baseline research is classified? We wouldn't. We'd see effects, unexplained changes in bacterial behavior or ecosystem function, but we wouldn't understand the cause. And by the time the problem became obvious enough to overcome institutional secrecy, it might be too late to respond effectively. This is the danger of suppressing scientific research for national security reasons. Sometimes the security it protects is an illusion. Sometimes transparency and collaboration are better defenses than secrecy and control. Some researchers have tried to sound this alarm. In 2022, a group of microbiologists published an open letter calling for international cooperation on ancient organism research. They argued that biosecurity concerns, while valid, shouldn't prevent responsible scientific investigation. They proposed creating international repositories for samples, standardized containment protocols, and transparent data sharing agreements that would protect public safety while advancing knowledge. The letter was signed by over 300 scientists from 40 countries. It received modest media attention, and then it was ignored by policymakers. The BCP remained in place. Research continued in secret facilities, and scientists like Dr. Bulat remained silent about what they had found. In August 2024, 11 years after the initial Lake Vostok breakthrough, something unprecedented happened. A researcher who had worked on classified biological projects began leaking documents to journalists. The whistleblower's identity remains protected, known only by the pseudonym Cryos. Through encrypted communications, Cryos provided documents, photographs, and data files to several independent journalists and science communicators. The materials didn't come all at once. They were released gradually, carefully, as if Cryos was testing the response or being cautious about exposure. The first release included laboratory photographs showing organisms under electron microscopy. The images were remarkable. The organisms had cellular structures that mixed characteristics of bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotic cells. Some had membrane structures that formed geometric patterns, almost crystalline in their regularity. Others showed what appeared to be internal compartmentalization, far more complex than bacterial cells should possess. The photographs were accompanied by minimal documentation, sample numbers that meant nothing without context, dates ranging from 2013 to 2022, location data that had been redacted. But even without full context, the images were extraordinary. Professional microbiologists who examined them confirmed these were not typical organisms and not obvious hoaxes. The second release, weeks later, included genetic sequence data, pages and pages of DNA-based pairs formatted in standard notation. Independent analysis of these sequences revealed something shocking. They contained sections that matched no known organisms in any genetic database. 0 matches. Not even partial homology with any described species. Moreover, the sequences showed unusual regularities. In natural DNA, you expect a certain amount of randomness, the accumulated result of mutation and selection over millions of years. These sequences had sections that were too ordered, too optimized. It was as if someone had edited them for efficiency. The third release was the most explosive. It included excerpts from research reports, heavily redacted but still informative. The documents discussed containment protocols for anomalous biological entities, or ABEs. They described experiments where ABEs were exposed to normal bacterial cultures and the genetic transfer that resulted. They mentioned concern about environmental release scenarios and ecosystem cascade effects. One document dated November 2013 included a recommendation that all ABE research be classified at the highest levels and restricted to facilities with BSL-4 containment or higher. BSL-4 is the maximum biosafety level used for the most dangerous pathogens like Ebola and smallpox. Whatever these ABs were, someone considered them at least as dangerous as the deadliest known diseases. Another document from 2017 discussed the Lake Vostok samples specifically. It mentioned Dr. Sergei Bulat by name and noted that Subject B has been cooperative following intervention and shows no signs of resuming unauthorized research or communication. The phrasing was chilling. Following intervention. What intervention? What had been done to ensure Bulat's cooperation? Journalists attempted to verify the documents. Some experts who examined them believed they were authentic based on format, terminology, and technical details that would be difficult for a forger to fake. Others remained skeptical, noting that sophisticated hoaxes are possible and that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But the documents raised disturbing questions. If authentic, they confirmed that research on ancient organisms had been systematically classified. They confirmed that these organisms had unusual and potentially dangerous characteristics, and they suggested that researchers who refused to cooperate with classification efforts might face consequences. Cryos continued releasing materials through late 2024. Each release added details, photographs of research facilities, including one that matched the location of the Siberian cave site, meeting notes from BCP coordination sessions discussing how to handle media inquiries about ancient organism research, and personal testimonies, brief statements from researchers describing pressure to suppress findings, threats of career destruction, and in some cases more direct intimidation. One testimony stood out. It came from a researcher who claimed to have worked directly with Bulat in 2013 before the suppression. This person, identified only as Researcher 7, described Bulat's excitement when he first analyzed the Lake Vostok samples. He knew immediately these were special, Researcher 7 wrote. He stayed in the laboratory for 3 days straight, barely sleeping, running test after test. He kept saying, "This changes everything." And he was right. It did change everything, just not in the way he hoped. Researcher 7 described the arrival of officials from Moscow. Unannounced visitors who spent hours reviewing Bulat's data. Then meetings where Bulat was told his findings were being classified for reasons of state security. Then escalating pressure when Bulat resisted, arguing that scientific knowledge should be public. Then the final intervention, whatever that was, after which Bulat agreed to everything. He wasn't the same after that, Researcher 7 wrote. Something in him had broken, or maybe been broken. He went through the motions of the retraction, said what they told him to say, but you could see it in his eyes. He knew what he'd lost. He knew what we'd all lost. These leaks from cryos created waves in the independent science community and among science journalists. But mainstream media largely ignored them. Major newspapers and television networks didn't cover the story. Scientific journals didn't discuss it. It remained confined to blogs, independent news sites, and social media. Why the silence? Some suggested the story was too complex, too difficult to verify, and too conspiracy theoretical for mainstream outlets. Others pointed to the political sensitivity of accusing multiple governments of suppressing research. And some darkly hinted that pressure was applied behind the scenes to prevent coverage. Whatever the reason, the cryos leaks failed to generate the public outrage or demand for transparency that might have forced governments to respond. The documents existed, available for anyone to examine, but most people never saw them, never heard about them, never knew that beneath the Antarctic ice and in Siberian caves and on Tibetan glaciers, discoveries had been made that challenged our understanding of life itself. And Dr. Sergei Bulat remained silent. Which brings us to today, January 2026. 13 years since Dr. Bulat first analyzed water from Lake Vostok. 11 years since his research vanished from the scientific record. 2 years since the cryos leaks briefly illuminated what might have been discovered and then suppressed. Where are we now? What do we know? And what remains mystery? We know that Lake Vostok exists, that drilling reached it, and that samples were extracted. This is documented, undisputed public record. We know that Dr. Sergey Bulat analyzed those samples and announced finding unusual bacterial life. This too is documented, though his announcement was subsequently retracted. We know that Bulat stopped publishing on this topic and has remained largely silent for over a decade. This is verifiable through publication databases and public records. Beyond these facts, we enter the realm of claims, leaks, testimonies, and speculation. We have leaked documents that might be authentic or might be sophisticated fabrications. We have anonymous accounts from researchers who might be genuine insiders or might be attention seekers. We have patterns that might indicate coordinated suppression or might simply reflect normal scientific controversy and the mundane difficulties of research funding and institutional politics. The truth is, we don't know for certain what Dr. Bulat found. We don't know if the organisms he described were real and unusual, or if they were contamination and misidentification. We don't know if his silence resulted from coercion, from professional disappointment, from personal choice, or from something more sinister. But we can be certain of this. The official narrative doesn't add up. Simple contamination doesn't explain the intensity of the response. Normal scientific failure doesn't explain the patterns of similar suppressions across multiple countries and multiple projects. Routine biosecurity concerns don't explain why research that could help us prepare for naturally occurring releases of ancient organisms is being kept secret. Something happened, something was found, something frightened people in positions of power enough that they created new international frameworks for suppressing research and silencing scientists. Maybe it was exactly what the leaks suggest. Organisms with unprecedented capabilities, genetic structures that challenge our understanding of life's possibilities, and the potential to alter Earth's biosphere in unpredictable ways. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Maybe the organisms were real, but not as dramatic as portrayed. Maybe the suppression was driven by geopolitical competition rather than genuine biosecurity concerns. Maybe different nations found different things in different isolated environments, and the secrecy is simply about maintaining scientific and technological advantages. We may never know the complete truth. Classified research can remain classified for decades. Scientists bound by non-disclosure agreements may never feel free to speak openly. And as years pass, memories fade. Evidence is destroyed, and the chance of learning what really happened diminishes. But the questions persist, and those questions matter. They matter because if unusual organisms exist in ancient isolated environments, we need to understand them before climate change releases them naturally. They matter because scientific knowledge suppressed today might be desperately needed tomorrow. They matter because transparency and accountability in science are not luxuries, but necessities. And they matter because somewhere in Russia, or perhaps somewhere else now, Dr. Sergey Bulat lives with the memory of touching water from 14 million years ago and seeing things no one else had seen. He knows the truth. He knows what was in that water, what it meant, and why it had to be hidden. Does he lie awake at night thinking about it? Does he regret his silence? Or has he made peace with the intervention, whatever it was, that ensured his cooperation? We can't ask him. Or rather, we can ask, but he won't answer. The 11 years of silence had become 13 years, and may well become 20, 30, or a lifetime. But others are still searching. Researchers continue drilling into ice and permafrost and isolated lakes. Climate change continues releasing ancient ice and the organisms within it. And somewhere, someone else will eventually find what Bulat found, or something similar. When that happens, will the pattern repeat? Will that researcher's work also vanish? Will they also be silenced? Or has enough time passed, has enough information leaked, that the next discovery will be different? Will transparency finally win out over secrecy? Will we finally learn what life can be when it evolves in isolation for millions of years? The scientist touched Lake Vostok's water. His research vanished for 11 years, and counting. But the water is still there. The organisms, if they exist, are still there. And the truth, suppressed or hidden or classified, still exists. Somewhere beneath the ice, in darkness and pressure and cold beyond imagining, life persists. Life that might be ordinary or might be extraordinary. Life that might be Earth's distant cousins or might be something far stranger. And until we can study it openly, until researchers like Dr. Bullitt can speak freely, until transparency replaces secrecy, we will continue living in a world where the most fundamental questions about life's possibilities remain unanswered. Not because we lack the capability to answer them, but because someone, somewhere, decided we shouldn't know. That is the true mystery of Lake Vostok. Not what organisms exist beneath the ice, but why we're not allowed to know. Not what Dr. Bullitt discovered, but why his discovery had to disappear. And that mystery, unlike the lake itself, isn't buried beneath kilometers of Antarctic ice. It's hidden in plain sight, in classified facilities and sealed documents and silenced scientists. All around us, if we know where to look. The question is, do we have the courage to keep looking? Do we have the determination to demand answers? Or will we accept the official narratives, the retractions and denials and assurances that everything is fine, nothing unusual was found, and there's nothing to worry about? Dr. Sergei Bullitt touched ancient water and saw ancient life. Then his research vanished, and in that vanishing a message was sent to every scientist who might follow. Some discoveries are too dangerous to share. Some knowledge is too powerful to be free, but knowledge, as Bullitt himself said, is very difficult to contain. This story isn't over. The water still flows beneath the ice. The organisms, whatever they are, still exist. And the truth, patient and persistent, waits for its moment to emerge. When it does, we will finally understand what the scientists saw, what frightened those in power, and why the discovery that should have changed everything was instead hidden away. Until then, we wait, we question, we search for fragments and clues and hints of truth. And we remember that beneath the frozen surface of our world, in places no human was meant to reach, mysteries remain. Mysteries that challenge what we think we know about life, about Earth, about our place in the universe. Mysteries that for now remain locked away, but not forgotten, never forgotten. The scientists touched the water, the world changed, and then pretended nothing had happened. But we know better, don't we?